And welcome back to Keys to Business Critical SOA Governance 6. This is Vance McCarthy, Program Director for the event. And this hour we are rejoined by Brent Carlson, Senior Vice President, Technology at SOA Software. Hello again, Brent.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Brent Carlson is a recognized leader in enterprise application architectures and SOA. At SOA Software, he focuses on the strategic direction and development of planning and development of governance. He comes to SOA Software via the company's recent acquisition this spring of Logic Library, where Brent was founder and CTO, and drove the development and delivery of the Logic Library product line. Prior to Logic Library, Brent was a 17-year veteran of IBM, where he served as lead architect for the WebSphere Business Component project and held several leadership roles on the IBM San Francisco project. In fact, he was the co-author of the San Francisco Design Pattern Blueprints for Business Software and Framework Process Patterns. He holds 19 hardware and software patents and was recently named to InfoWorld's prestigious Top 25 CTO. In today's talk, SOA Development Governance Best Practices, Brent will discuss how companies can get SOA right from the start and discusses several important SOA secrets, including how to initiate governance at the design and development phase, carry that work through the deployment operation, and the importance of integrated SOA governance automation. Brent will also share some lessons learned from key SOA software customers. One housekeeping item before we begin. Some of Brent's slides are quite detailed, so to see them in a larger window, simply click the Enlarge Slide button at the bottom of your screen. To ask a question, simply minimize that screen and type your question into the Ask a Question box. And now, Brent, get us started with SOA Development Governance Best Practices.
Thanks, Vance. Again, appreciate the opportunity to spend the next 45 minutes or so in front of this audience. I think I have some interesting content here, and hopefully you'll find a lot of value with what I have to say. Before I get into the detailed discussion around SOA Development Governance Best Practices, I want to spend a little bit of time looking at the broader context of SOA governance, or the SOA lifecycle. As we touched on in the upfront Q&A session, I made some points about the need to really look beyond just the SDLC when looking at SOA governance or the SOA lifecycle. And our perspective at SOA Software is that you really need to focus on three core aspects of governance with supporting technology enabling those governance perspectives. And those core perspectives are planning, in other words, building the right services, development, building those services right or the right way, and ultimately operations, then running them right or running them the right way. Underneath all that, then, is a consistent policy definition and declarative provisioning environment. And, of course, you need to deal with both the distributed and the mainframe environment in your SOA. And while a lot of organizations are focusing much of their SOA initiatives in the distributed environment, there are many, many large enterprises that have mainframe implementation that are not going away anytime soon, but need to be exposed into the SOA because there's some core business functionality running out in those mainframe environments. And so I'll be briefly touching on the important aspects of mainframe as a governed service platform as well. So let's start drilling into the various aspects of the end-to-end enterprise SOA lifecycle, starting with planning. Planning really needs to focus on how do I achieve a quicker return on my SOA investment. And there's two perspectives here that we need to look at. What we refer to as build to plan and build to priority. Build to plan is really the, if you think about traditional EA concepts, that's the top-down or to-be perspective that the organization is mapping out. At the end of our initiative, where do I want to be? What do I want my organization to look like? What sort of functional capabilities do I want to have in place? How do I want these capabilities to be expressed into my environment? And so typically that's going to be done through some sort of an architectural assessment, maybe business process modeling analysis, decomposing into a set of services, and then identifying at least candidate services that need to be built out. Building to priority then applies business needs. What do I need to build out first? What do I need to build out next? Aligning those business needs against a set of services that have been defined as candidate, and then funding or allocating them out to the organization. If you don't take this approach, you're going to end up with ultimately a set of project-based services. It's really not SOA, although organizations may call it SOA. I like to call that ABOS, a bunch of services. You simply have built out some external capabilities. You used web service technology. You built, in essence, monolithic applications on top of web service technology, but you really didn't get advantage, the reuse advantage out, and you really didn't change your culture. You're not changing your mindset. And so we think planning governance is crucial to get your organization going the right way in SOA. Some of the aspects that you need to look at in terms of planning governance, modeling your environment properly, identifying your existing capabilities. In other words, you can think of that as harvesting assets from your existing runtime and development infrastructure, and then identifying and prioritizing those services. And ultimately, you want to apply consistent policy across your enterprise SOA lifecycle. Policy definition and provisioning begins in the planning phase. And so you can see in our puzzle diagram that you see here that policy is an integral part of the planning phase as well as the other phases of your SOA enterprise lifecycle. Of course, when you're done planning, you're going to have a set of services, candidate services that you need to build out. And that brings us then to development governance, or the development governance phase. Why are we focused on development governance in an SOA initiative? Well, of course, you want to build things right. You want to get your development done properly. It's important not only to have correctly functioning services, but complete services, and I'll get into what that means a bit later down the road. You need to provide enough infrastructure to the organization so that they can build things properly. So not only the executable assets that support your development, but knowledge assets such as patterns and best practices. And ultimately what you're trying to do is build up a suite of services that are truly SOA class services to enable the organization to more quickly adapt to changing business needs. You also want to focus on getting these services defined and implemented properly early in the development phase. There's some interesting studies, a couple of them quoted here, that you can save a lot of money both in terms of fixing problems that occur as well as reducing application downtime because you're going to have a more stable environment if you apply proper development governance processes. If you don't apply proper development governance processes to your organization, guess what's going to happen? Well, you're going to build things incorrectly and consistently, you're going to build redundant functionality, and you're going to end up with fragile applications. So what are some of the aspects that you need to be considering during development governance? You need to be able to discover the assets that support your services in your environment. You need to have a federated view across all of the SDLC tools, and I'll be touching on that later on in our detailed discussion. You need to automate your development governance as much as possible to scale out your initiative. It's fine to have a pilot initiative that is focused around your best and brightest people in the organization to get your processes nailed and done properly, but once you've done that, now you have to figure out how to get that implemented across the entire organization, and automation is crucial to make that happen. As you stand up your SOA, you need to start being concerned about impact analysis. As I mentioned in the earlier Q&A session, that impact analysis, because of the loosely coupled nature of SOA, becomes quite crucial. You can make a change in one area and not even realize that you're going to affect a downstream application or service if you don't have a good view over your dependency management. Finally, the third primary perspective, operations governance. We want to run services right. And here we want to focus on both the security aspects, provisioning from a provisioning perspective, protecting services against malicious attacks, minimizing the risk to exposing data. And we all know, heard of many of these high-profile cases that have occurred in the past few years of the ramifications of data exposure, the black eye that can give corporations. And with more and more services exposed outside the firewall to business partners, that becomes increasingly important. We also need to make sure we meet our service level commitments, both to internal and external customers. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is minimize downtime, reduce the cost of development, and lower the cost of change because we're running things properly. If I don't manage my deployed services properly, well, we're not going to trust that environment, and we're going to have concerns about security exposure. We're maybe not even able to pass the audits that the organization is mandating upon us because of perhaps governmental regulations around healthcare or corporate governance initiatives such as HIPAA or Sarbox. We're going to end up with interoperability problems. We're going to end up building a lot of glue code just to wire things together, and we're back to that point-to-point spaghetti that we've been trying to get away from. So operations is all about end-to-end security, making sure that we can trust the message from its inception all the way to the target implementation and ensure that the content is properly managed, provisioning outside of the firewall, providing appropriate performance management and monitoring so that you can understand, am I truly meeting my SLAs, and flag situations where we're not meeting those SLAs, and provide then the interoperability environment across multiple platforms, because the reality is most organizations have a wide variety of deployment platforms, including the mainframe environment that needs to be brought into the SOA. Which brings us to the last overview section that I want to touch on here, and that is the mainframe SOA exposing a CICS environment, for example, as a governed service platform. Organizations have spent a lot of money building out mainframe capabilities, and these have been built out over decades. Core business functionality continues to run on mainframe-based servers, and they're not going away anytime soon. But there are aspects of those mainframe-based server applications that would be really advantageous if we get exposed as services into an SOA. So we want to figure out a way to expose those capabilities as properly defined services, not simply just point-to-point replication of specific copybook capabilities, for example, but provide sophisticated functionality exposing assembled processes that the mainframe can support up into the SOA environment. Not only just simply exposing these as web services, but making it true part of your SOA infrastructure and SOA governance environment. Appropriate security, appropriate policy provisioning in a declarative fashion so that you're not treating the mainframe as a one-off, but really allowing it to be a first-class citizen along with everything else running your SOA. And giving your mainframe developers the right tools so that they don't have to learn a whole new set of development techniques and infrastructure, but can simply work within an environment that is comfortable to them, but still gives them leading-edge web service capabilities and service governance capabilities in an SOA. So here, our objective is to, again, harvest those mainframe capabilities, programs, and transactions, make it very simple, automate as much as possible, exposing those capabilities as web services, allowing those mainframe applications in turn to consume web services coming from outside the mainframe, providing that consistent policy environment across all deployed platforms in the SOA infrastructure, and then give those developers a clean portal-based approach. In the case of the SOLA product within SOA software, it is a Web 2.0-based thin client that provides a very nice, comfortable development environment for CICS-type developers to work within. If we then take a step back and look at the end-to-end perspective, this is an interesting way, I think, of presenting that end-to-end SOA lifecycle, SOA governance perspective, starting with the planning governance perspective. The planning governance perspective results in a set of service candidates that in turn are provisioned forward into development governance. Development governance results in a set of produced services that are fed into the staging environment, ultimately released into the operating environment, and managed through deprecation to that operational governance environment. And then an underlying consistent policy definition environment or policy governance environment spanning all these perspectives. You notice at the bottom of this slide we see our enterprise lifecycle. Don't get hung up on the stages of the terminology here. That's just one representation. But the reality is that the important point that you need to take away here is that SOA governance expands beyond traditional SDLC, beyond traditional operational monitoring, all the way back to planning, and you need to tie things together end-to-end, putting that change management perspective into place. The third dimension of this graphic, I think, is also important. SOA governance is more than just services and policy and the security profiles. You really need to get into all the other piece parts that make up your SOA. The knowledge assets, the support building things properly, the supporting artifacts that result from development activities, the supporting artifacts that define a service candidate so it's understandable and can be handed off to the development team. And that's what the third dimension of this graphic is meant to represent. And here you see, layered on top of this slide, then, the three core governance products inside the SOA software product suite: Repository Manager, what was previously known as Logitech, providing the development governance; Service Manager, providing the operational governance platform; and Policy Manager, previously known as Workbench, providing that end-to-end governance capability. Of course, with the SOLA product, providing the mainframe support and wiring in the Policy Manager and Service Manager for consistency. All right, so with that background in place, now I'd like to drill down into core development governance best practices for your organization. I'm going to touch on 5 best practices And hopefully that at least one of them will click with you, and hopefully by the end of the session, you'll have some items that you want to take forward into your organization. I've already hit on this point, but I think it's important to reiterate it. If you don't apply appropriate development governance to your SOA, you're going to end up building things that look like this house, for example, this ramshackle house, instead of a nicely architected or using the central planning metaphor that organizations often use, a well-thought-out service infrastructure within your SOA. You're going to end up with inconsistent and substandard implementations. You're going to end up building things over and over again simply because people don't know about capabilities that are already present. You're going to have a bunch of parts that just don't fit together properly, and it's going to be difficult to manage. Again, this is what I refer to ABOS, a bunch of services. And ultimately, this notion of being able to build out an SOA with project-centric mindset is what can trap us to go down this path. If you don't have a broader than project-centric perspective in your organization, you very well are going to likely end up with this sort of approach. Not to say that projects aren't important in the SOA, and I'm going to touch on that a bit, but you need to have somebody looking out for the broader, the whole of the organization in parallel with that project-centric notion as you build out against the specific project needs. So if we think then about development governance, there's what and there's how. The how is the process that I need to apply, and the SDLC is a part of that process, and I'll be touching on the aspects of the SDLC that are particularly crucial in an SOA. We also need to talk about the what. And the what of development governance are things that we refer to as software development assets. A software development asset is anything of value to the IT organization. And I tend to break these down into two major categories. Knowledge assets, things like architectures, best practices, processes, design patterns, reference implementations, things that help my development teams build software properly. And then also the executable assets, web services that have been built in the past, elements that help us make up or build up those web services, such as data views, components, mainframe applications, what have you, schemas that support consistent domain information across web services. All those would be considered executable assets. And the SDAs that we're talking about here, they are a level above the individual development artifacts that are produced by the development process. So artifacts that make up the SDAs are things like the actual source code, schemas, models, executable modules, test plans, things that we mandate in order to consider a service complete, maybe a usage guide, maybe some sample code using the service. All those would be considered artifacts. We also need to make these assets searchable and reportable. So that's where this notion of classification or taxonomies come into play, and I'll be touching more on that later on. I consider three key categories of classifiers to be important to the organization, and that's the technical aspect of the asset that I'm managing. What language is it written in? Are there specific restrictions around the deployment environment? Do I need a particular version of an app server because I have a dependency on a particular open source component that app server is deployed, things like that. The functionality aspects, how can I quickly understand where this service fits into my business architecture? And then the business aspects, what organizational aspects, what organization built this service, what initiative was it built for, how much effort did it take to build the service so we can calculate a return on investment once it gets used in the organization, things like that. And then we also need to understand how this service maps or aligns itself with other assets, dependencies and other assets, what patterns did I apply when I implemented the service so it's easier to maintain, things like that that are going to help us with the downstream impact analysis or change management of our environment. And you probably already picked up on this last point, but SDAs are much broader than just services within an SOA. We're back to that iceberg metaphor. The service interface is the part of the iceberg above the waterline. There's a lot of interesting stuff that I need to manage underneath the waterline. And if I'm not managing that stuff, I'm very likely going to create downstream stability issues in my SOA, not taking care of that. So then graphically, if we look at what this notion of SDA or development governance repositories managing SDAs, to be more precise, looks like, we have on the bottom of this slide then the end-to-end point tools, your SDLC systems of record that you're already using today, your requirement management platforms, your document management platforms, your modeling tools, your SCMs, your test automation environments, your defect tracking environments, all those tools that you're using today, and you're using probably multiple instances of these tools, and if you're from an enterprise of any size, you still need to use those. You still need to services. What a development governance repository such as Repository Manager gives you then is the ability to assemble these SDAs with references to the artifacts defined and managed in these systems of record, the ability to apply then searchable and reportable metadata over the top and relationships over the top, and the ability to govern the production and consumption of these services. And that's what I'm going to be spending a lot of time focusing on here going forward. We think about then what building services mean in an SOA, just to summarize a bit here. Build it and they will come might work for the field of dreams, but it's not going to work for SOA. I might have the best service in the world, but if I don't tell anybody about it, nobody's going to use it. Or if I might have a service that was built for a specific project, if nobody knows about it, that I built it for this project, there's no way we can enhance it to make it enterprise class or SOA class to be used across the organization. Again, that's not to say we can ignore the project or tactical needs of the organization, but we need to balance between those tactical needs and the strategic needs or end-to-end organizational needs of the enterprise. And if you apply appropriate development governance, you can help bring this into balance. I alluded to this earlier in our discussion. What makes a service usable in the organization? It's not enough for a service to be correct. It must also be complete. Completeness is going to vary based on organization, but there's some core principles you need to think about in order to be complete. The service needs to be maintainable. We need to manage multiple versions of the service as we deploy and enhance that service. This gets into the notion of managing services as products, which I'm going to drill down into later in this session. Those services need to be discoverable. I need to be able to find them. If I want to build an application and I need to do a credit check, I sure would like to know that somebody else has built a strong, highly secure credit checking service that I can leverage right off the bat. Or if I don't have one, I want to collaborate with others to help find that service down the road. And then once I find it, can I quickly understand how to use this service and apply it in that consumption side application? And we achieve this by applying development governance principles through three key perspectives. The production perspective, in other words, building the services out, bringing them to a point where they can be consumed. The distribution perspective, so that those produced services can be made visible from an impact analysis and from a downstream searchability perspective. And then once I've found relevant services, how do I consume those services, the service consumption perspective, and establishing the appropriate traceability over those consumption activities. So now that we've defined these three key perspectives, I want to touch on 5 key best practices that we've discerned through our active engagements with many large enterprises over the past years deploying our product into this sort of environment. 3 key best practices on the production side, 1 key best practice on the distribution perspective, and 1 key best practice on the consumption perspective. And you may note, well, why are there 3 perspectives on the production side? Because getting SOA services built correctly or built right, as I talked about earlier, is really hard. I mean, it can be really difficult in the organization to think about how to get these services aligned for broader than just my specific project needs. So you need to spend time focusing on the production side, and there are 3 key aspects that we think are relevant to an organization in helping you to do this. And when you take those aspects and bring them into your organization, you're going to find that building out those services in an SOA is going to be much more manageable and much easier, and you're going to get much more consistency. All right, so let's hit our first best practice, pragmatic service definition. And you may have already picked up on this point, but I'm a big fan of the meet-in-the-middle approach. You can't sit there and assume that just because I need a service for a project, it's going to be a SOA class service. You're going to end up just building out spaghetti code with XML flavored sauce and layered on top of the other piles of spaghetti that you already have in the organization. You don't want to take that approach. But you can't sit there and say, I'm going to architect the world and define everything that I need before I build anything. That results in analysis paralysis. And I've seen organizations with an enterprise architecture culture that enables that sort of behavior, and guess what? They never get their SOA off the ground. Or even worse, they may try to get their SOA off the ground by building everything at once and get that big bang disaster project, the death march type projects that can kill people figuratively in the development organization and end up building nothing that's really of value to the organization. So we need to strike a pragmatic balance between that business needs and where the business is. Where the business is, our source system capabilities, our existing capabilities, we already have a set of applications that are running the business. And we need need to ensure that we don't break those capabilities, but we want to enhance and expose aspects of those capabilities out going forward, so we have more flexibility. And that flexibility in a properly defined SOA is going to be enabled through a set of loosely coupled business services, exposed through a common technical infrastructure binding together heterogeneous runtime environments and supporting flexible business process definition. Sounds like a great environment to aim for. And that's really what any SOA's top-level objective should be, tying business and IT together. So from a top-down, we need to establish at least a coarse-grained business architecture, business model framework. And I've got here a simple UML representation of a portion of an e-commerce business domain. So you can see some of the core domain functionality areas with representative candidate service functionalities that have been decomposed from those areas. You may have started this by laying out some business processes and then assembling those business processes or the steps in the business processes into specific groupings that would ultimately get represented in this sort of an approach. And you don't want to take this too deep. You want to lay out enough of a roadmap so that you can understand what your plan needs to look like, referring back to our service planning governance discussion earlier in this session, and so that you can then overlay your business initiative needs, business prioritization needs on top of this. Just enough architecture is a principle to carry here. Once I've done that, then I need to take my specific business initiatives and prioritize those services based on those initiatives and begin to flesh out the details. And this is where I need to connect the dots against my existing systems and begin to really get into, okay, what does this service need to provide in this wave of implementation? We don't have to build everything that this service might ever need to build out, but I need to build enough flexibility to at least support maybe a couple or three different business processes. And ideally, an SOA-based service or SOA class service ought to have 2 or 3 different sets of requirements coming at it so that I can begin to broaden the capabilities out from a project-specific set of needs. That's not to say you can't build a service with a single consumer, but you probably ought not to consider that an SOA class service. I like to think of those as 0.9 level or version services that might get promoted into an SOA class service down the road, and they're good fodder for consideration. But they probably aren't flexible enough to really be considered SOA class right out of the box. Okay, next best practice, production governance lifecycle processes. And here it's important to get your processes in place, both in terms of the key checkpoints as well as how you're going to have your stakeholders involved in the process or the review activities. And I'm going to start with the latter point first. I believe it's quite important to establish a matrix architectural governance or checkpoint or review team within your organization, whatever you choose to call this. I think it needs to be anchored to some sort of core architecture group. Maybe it's an EA group, maybe it's a governance group, maybe it's a center of competency group, whatever your organization chooses to call it, that needs to be anchored there and should be anchored, that group in turn should be anchored at the CIO level so it has enough authority and enough clout to drive organizations to proper behavior. You also want to bring in then the line of business or development team members into this matrix organization. You want to do that for a couple of reasons. One, you eliminate the us versus them mentality by doing this, or you at least mitigate that. You're not getting the EA team shoving something down my throat reaction because we're all in this together. And two, you're going to gain a lot of interesting cross-fertilization across these teams. Team members are coming from different perspectives. They're going to be communicating with each other on a regular basis, both formally and informally through the governance processes, and you're going to learn a lot. You're going to potentially even identify new services that need to be prioritized up in the flow because of informal discussion. Your business analysts may have done some initial work, but as your architects get involved and key leads get involved, they may discover some lower-level services that can provide just as much value as the higher-level services identified by the business analyst, and that notion of active discovery can help you advance your SOA more quickly. This team is also going to be involved in the checkpoint process or review process, governance process, to ensure that the services are both correct and complete, as I talked about earlier. And ultimately, they're going to be the ones who flip the switch that allow that service to be published out into the development governance repository for downstream consumption, the distribution of those services. Ideally, I'd like to see this team have the ability to recommend resource allocation downstream. They're the ones who have the best view of what's going on in the organization. They have connectivity to the business side, they have connectivity to the development side, And so they know where the touch points are, where the pain points are, and so funding an additional developer to support a service that's in high demand so that you can maintain that service and deal with the incoming requests, service requests, they might be able to recommend that and head off a problem down the road, for example. Getting then to the review points, every organization is going to have their own review processes in the development governance environment. We recommend if you don't have your own mindset in place here, at least you ought to be thinking about these three key phases: requirements complete phase, design complete phase, development complete phase. And they're pretty self-explanatory, and they're common checkpoints in any SDLC, but you do have some broader perspectives here. You're looking at the outside or project perspectives as well as the project-specific perspectives as you do in your governance. So you want to ensure that you provide an appropriate usage guide once development is complete, for example. You want to provide an automated test cases so that it's easy to do regression testing down the road, make it easy for consuming applications to pick up the service and understand how it's to be used. You want to make sure you have sufficient documentation so you can manage multiple versions of the service as you enhance your SOA, et cetera, et cetera. And you might have other checkpoints in your organization, but at least consider these three going forward. Here's a representative design complete governance checkpoint example. You might do some automated validation. That's one of the interesting capabilities I think that the SOA software product suite gives you, is the ability through Policy Manager to define these declarative compliance policies and have Repository Manager automatically invoke these capabilities, returning the results back to the governance engine going forward. Nice set of capabilities built into a deep integration across the products. Once you validate against that, if you fail, you probably want to kick it back to the submitter, have them fix the problem. If you're valid from a declarative sense, then you want to get key role players, maybe architects, maybe business analysts involved, to review the actual content that's been mandated, the work products that have been mandated, so that they are, in fact, compliant with the expectations of the organization. And then we can go forward to the development governance phase in this example, and the implementation can be completed, the test cases can be completed, testing can be completed, and we can go forward with then that development governance checkpoint at the appropriate time. All right, third key production best practice, managing services as products. This is the crucial best practice, I think. If you don't take anything else away from this session, take this one away. You really need to treat your services as products. You need to manage services across a well-defined release cycle so that my consumers are not tempted to go off and build their own functionality, because I'm not going to get new capabilities for 18 months. I can't wait that long. It might be a 3-month cycle, might be more quickly than that in your organization, might be a little bit longer than that in your organization, depending upon the velocity of your IT organization, but you need to give them enough chance to drop into your versioning so that they're not tempted to go off and build their own capabilities. You want to preserve backward compatibility wherever possible. Sometimes it's not possible, so you need to provide deprecation policies so that organizations have an understanding of when they need to move off. And as I mentioned in the Q&A session up front, there's some very interesting capabilities in the operational governance space that SOA software provides through service managers, virtualization capabilities that can help you mitigate some of these deprecation issues. And you also want to gather requirements from current and potential customers. And I like to think of introducing a product manager role into the organization. Just as an ISV like SOA software has a product manager to coordinate incoming requirements and help prioritize release plans, I think you need to do that with each service in your organization. Somebody who has their finger on the pulse of the organization and can help pull things together into a coherent definition. Other aspects in terms of the SDLC tools that come into play when you start dealing with services as products. Your SCM or version control repository, you need to have a good baselining set of policies in place. Whenever you release a version of a service into production, you better make sure you have a code base you can maintain. And so you're going to need to be maintaining that version of the service while developing the next version. And you may even have multiple versions, back-level versions that you have to maintain depending upon your deprecation policies. You better be tracking your requirements and your defects on a version-by-version basis so you have traceability and understand what gets impacted as you make fixes. Do I need to make fixes going forward? Do I need to enhance this functionality into a back-level version of the service, things like that. And you should put an appropriate service versioning lifecycle in place as well. And here's an example of versioning lifecycle that's consistent with what we talked about earlier. Going all the way from proposed, which might be managed in your service planning governance platform, all the way through approved, development, production, deprecated, and finally obsolete. it's shut down. It's not live in the runtime environment. It's simply managed in your repositories for archival purposes. Moving on to distribution. And the core distribution best practice for development governance is putting a development governance repository in place. I can't count the number of organizations that have tried to do this through static approaches or simple websites, and they often have become customers of Logic Library, now SOA software, because those approaches just fail. They don't scale. Spreadsheets, they get out of date, people can't find them, they can't maintain them, and you end up building your own stuff and creating redundancy. Call the architect game is not a good idea either. They become bottlenecks in the organization. One of our early customers shared with me that this organization had a dozen services deployed, and they were meant to be SOA class services. And by the time they had those dozen services deployed, his team was spending 80% of the time dealing with incoming requests. Where is the service? How do I use it? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They were not able to do their real jobs. Not effective. You need to automate these capabilities. And organizations tried to use UDDI for this. Not designed for that. It's really not suited for development use. It's really oriented around services and schemas. The UI can often be difficult. It's a somewhat arcane taxonomic structure, and it's not well suited to managing other SDA types. And that's why development governance repository space has emerged over the past years, and why products such as Repository Manager exist. So you need to deploy this repository into your environment to help distribution of your services and the supporting SDAs that help your SOA be effective into the organization. Some key things you need to be looking at. You need to provide governance automation around service assembly and validation. That also includes extraction from existing point systems of record. Automate as much as possible so you're not in the face of the developer and they don't feel like they have extra work to do. And then route this information through to the key stakeholders in the governance processes that I talked about. Getting information exposed out to the organization through automated publication processes, automated compliance validation, passive and active distribution modes. You need to be able to subscribe both as users and projects, which gets to the distribution consumption mode that I'll be talking about in our final best practice. Put that in place. Multiple search modes. One of the interesting capabilities of Repository Manager is the ability to graphically search through a graphical representation of your business or technical architecture or both. Pretty slick capability to make it more accessible. And you need to deliver where the organization needs to consume these information. So deep IDE integration, we think, is quite important, and we spent a lot of energy integrating into the Eclipse, both native and commercial, as well as the Visual Studio environments. You also want to expose this rich set of APIs because as your organization becomes more sophisticated in governance, you may want to tie more automation across more products and tools in your environment. Last best practice, consumption best practice, you've got to track where your services are used. And you need to, at a minimum, have a named user-based tracking. Ideally, you have project-based tracking. So this is where the rubber meets the road, where I need to understand these business initiatives that were funded, what applications that are being built ultimately used what services. That one lets you go back to see, did I do my planning correctly? Did I miss some things that I should have planned for? Did I plan for some things that weren't ultimately needed? Can we improve our planning process as a result? And also gives us the ability to manage impact analysis going forward. So I can understand if I touch this service or I touch the schema that defines the meta model for this service, what applications are going to get impacted, what deprecation situations are going to occur, and how do I manage that so I don't get those 2 a.m. Sunday morning phone calls that tell me that when I deployed my new version of a service, a whole bunch of applications went down and we're in a fire drill trying to resolve that. So those notifications that I'm referencing here can be important in helping organizations avoid those sorts of situations. Get that traceability in place that gives you the impact analysis. Also lets you feed organizational feedback mechanisms. Am I really being successful? What's my ROI off my services? Am I able to prove that we're really saving money with SOA as well as building business flexibility? Wrap up in the final couple minutes here. I want to just briefly run through the product line, the SOA software product line. We touched on the different perspectives of the SOA software product family. You can see now the products represented here. Interesting to note that in the planning governance space, we will be delivering a new product in the second half of 2008. It's coming along nicely, and I think it fits very nicely with the principles that I've laid out here. First, we have Repository Manager for development, integrated deeply with Policy Manager. Operations, Service Manager provides deep integration again with Policy Manager. And then for the mainframe environment, the SOA both the runtime and the SOA developer product, both integrated with Policy Manager. Policy Manager providing that consistent declarative policy store environment. Architecturally, then, if we look at how these products interact with each other, of course, Policy Manager is a core to the organization. And this is where you have policy-level governance defining the consistent policies across the different governance perspectives, and then associating them with the appropriate metadata so that they can be automatically and declaratively provisioned into the different perspectives, the planning, development, and runtime perspectives. You can see that the interaction between Policy Manager and Service Manager is all standards-based. I think that's quite important. A Service Manager, in turn, then provides native agents in the various runtimes that are popular in the organizations today: WebSphere, WebLogic, JBoss, various .NET infrastructures, of course, the CICS environment via SOA. And so you have ability to create a consistent view over a heterogeneous environment. Repository Manager leveraging, again, those Policy Manager capabilities, both in terms of policy application as well as provisioning across the consumption and production perspectives as you move forward into the runtime environment, the Service Manager operational environment via the Policy Manager integration and its embedded registry capabilities. If we look at a day in the life of a service, I think one key value add that SOA software gives is that end-to-end perspective. We own and develop all the products in our product family, so you're going to have a consistent flow, a common meta model, a common governance process definition, and common validation process, policy validation process across all these perspectives. And so you don't have to worry. That's one less thing you have to worry about in getting your SOA right. Finally, to summarize, governance is essential to your SOA. If you don't put governance in place, you're going to end up with ABOS or worse. There's no one-size-fits-all governance model. You need to think about what's right for your organization, just enough process. I like to think about, you need to think about how it's going to impact people, what policies are going to apply, what processes need to be applied, and then you want to leverage technology to enable that. Don't fall into the trap of saying, just because somebody's got a set of products that you got your SOA governance nailed, you need to do thinking up front. And if you pick the right vendor as a partner, they can help you with that thinking up front and getting it deployed into the automation environment. And that automation environment lets you scale up your SOA initiative. You're not going to be scalable without automation. That's been proven over and over again with many of our customers. And that must encompass the end-to-end lifecycle, from service planning, portfolio planning, all the way out to operations. From a development governance perspective, what we talked about, just to refresh, you need to federate with existing SDLC tools and systems of record. You need to guide services both through compliance validation and the role-based review and sign-up processes in the production standpoint. We need to be connected upstream planning governance, downstream operational governance seamlessly so that you have a flow end-to-end and a common perspective. And you need to have traceability from the consumption standpoint. Ultimately, that closed-loop solution is what matters to your organization. And if you have that in place, you have a good chance of deploying a successful SOA that can grow with the organization. And with that, I will wrap up.
Brett Carlson, thanks very much for that very wide view of the emerging differences and new trends in the SOA lifecycle. In fact, you touched on so many topics that we've got a nice list of questions that also run across the lifecycle. So with your permission, let's get started with some questions.
Sounds good.
The first question came in within about 5 minutes of when you were talking to your initial slides, and I think it hit a theme that many of our attendees share. The question reads, we have many bunches of services as our SOA has been driven by ROI for specific projects. Where do we go now to maximize our investment or maybe unify that into a framework?
That's a very common situation, and certainly don't want to dismiss the value of building web services for specific projects. That's a great starting point that can help you move forward into an SOA. What you want to do is understand what those service capabilities are and treat them, again, as that notion of version 0.9 from a SOA class service standpoint. You might populate them into your repository and treat them as source capabilities going forward so that as application developers initiate their searches for capabilities, as business analysts plan out the next wave of applications, they can see what information is already exposed to services. Maybe the service in its current form is sufficient for the next usage, and so you simply need to do some hardening around the completeness aspect. Or maybe it needs to be incrementally enhanced, and so you're going to create then that version 1.0 of the service, building on the capabilities built in the project-specific capabilities. If you put all this information together into a common repository, you have a chance of looking across that perspective and of that opportunistic use of services come to bear, that active discovery that I talked about in one of the production side best practices. And I think you can start to see relatively quick payback, which can be important in adoption of your SOA at the executive level as they start to see then the benefits that were promised with SOA are really starting to hit the ground early on.
And just a quick follow-up on that. I mean, you talked a lot about the idea of using a repository to review your assets. Are there other places, specific places in an SOA project or even maybe across the enterprise, multiple SOA projects where your customers found commonality among those projects, even if the project managers weren't in direct contact with each other?
Sure. We've seen numerous cases where a service that was posted up into the repository environment was discovered by another organization. One customer comes to mind. I can't share the customer name, but they achieved sizable savings in millions of dollars as a result of posting up a set of services into the repository environment. And they also had a reward model for the production teams. In fact, it got so interesting that this was an organization that had many mainframe-based applications that were provisioning the underlying services, and they had to modify their reward model because the mainframe teams that were building the bulk of the service implementation were not getting enough recognition for their effort in supporting the SOA, so they ended up spreading the rewards across the teams that were exposing the services and the teams that were delivering the underlying mainframe capabilities. I think that's an interesting example, and it even resulted in sharing across lines of business.
Excellent, Brent. Thanks very much. The next question has to do with policy, and specifically it reads, do you find legacy policies for both IT or business need a lot of adjustment when they move to SOA? If so, what tools or patterns do you offer that can help me there?
That's a good question. There are some policies that I think can remain quite stable in an SOA environment, but there are other policies that need to be revisited. I think one, if we use policy in the broadest sense, this notion of completeness of reusable assets or SDAs within the organization is a core policy that needs to be adjusted. I can't just send a development team off in the corner, have them come out 3 months later with a monolithic application that's self-contained and that nobody else needs to understand but themselves. I have to put that sort of enforcement in place. The heterogeneous nature of SOA forces me to think along the lines of how do I support interoperability. So some of the standards efforts around, say, WSI, for example, come into play and need to be brought to bear to development governance. And, of course, that loosely coupled nature of SOA forces me to think about downstream quality of service aspects for my operational usage of the services. Do I need to give certain customers of my services priority, be based on legal agreements, contractual agreements, etc.? How do I ensure security? It's much easier to expose capabilities out in an SOA environment than in a monolithic application environment, so I better make sure I have good security practices and policies in place. And ultimately, how do I define these things? Well, working with companies such as ourselves, where we have a lot of experience in the industry, working with some strong SIs who've been living in this space for as long as the space has existed, they can help you get jump-started into this sort of a definition.
And in your product line, the SOA software product line, including Logic Library, do you have any policies or patterns or tooling that would help me define when that update or modification of my policy might be required?
We certainly do. When we deliver our products into the customer's environment, they are not empty shells, if you will. They come preloaded with valuable content that both in terms of knowledge assets, for example, Repository Manager, we have the rights to redistribute the Core J2EE patterns from Sun, as well as Microsoft Enterprise patterns to the organization so they can be preloaded into your environment. We also deliver the products with a consistent end-to-end meta model for service definition. The meta model is a big word, but ultimately what that means is that we have consistent service definition and supporting information around those services all the way from the earliest phases of planning out to operations, and that information is shared automatically across the products. We also deploy a consistent, predefined governance model, process model into your organization, and all this is pre-configured. So you can use what we ship out of the box, or you can work with us and we'll help you declaratively define the changes that you want to align the product specifically with your environment and it's seamlessly deployed and automatically updated into your environment. So definitely you shouldn't be looking for trying to do this all on your own. You should take advantage of the experiences that has been gained over the years by leading vendors such as ourselves. We deliver a set of pre-built policies in the policy manager that are automated, for example, lined up with the process automation. So take advantage of that. You're going to have your own special case needs. Everybody does. Everybody's special. But there's a lot of commonality, and the 80-20 rule comes into play. You can leverage the common 80% and then do your work around specializing for the 20%, and make sure whatever products you buy are fully declarative in nature so that you have a very flexible environment in meeting it to your specific needs.
Excellent. Thanks, Brent. Let's move over to, here's another IT to business convergence sort of questions. Do your patterns or best practices suggest a COE process, and do we need one?
I think there's value in a COE or Center of Competency or core architectural team, whatever you want to call that. There's definitely this notion of expertise that has been gained perhaps through a piloting initiative that needs to be shared across the organization. You don't want to set up this COE as an ivory tower organization. That's a mistake I've seen organizations make. That creates the political friction. It also allows the COE to become isolated from reality. And so you want to balance that core set of expertise with the matrixed organization that I recommended earlier, bringing in real live issues from real live project teams and letting them grow, the individuals participating in a matrix fashion from those teams, letting them grow in their knowledge and understanding of the broader needs of the business through interaction with the core team members and with other project team members that have been matrixed in. I think that's a nice balance, and I've seen that work successfully in organizations.
Terrific. That's always a bit of a slippery slope depending on whether you're on the operations or the IT development side. So thanks very much.
It certainly is, yes. And there's no one right answer for that applies across everybody. You really need to work out based on your own corporate culture and structural practices what works for you.
Here's another question which also goes to that issue of design time to operations time. How do we start to federate our waterfall SDLC into an SOA lifecycle approach? Do you have tools or patterns for that?
Yeah, no, it starts all the way back in the planning phase. Waterfall assumes I have a constant static set of requirements that are going to flow through into an application that gets delivered. And the reality is you need more flexibility than that. So defining business capabilities up front in doing the mapping against the candidate services that I need to build out, and then allowing those services to flow through and drop into waves of service delivery, not expecting that you're going to build every single capability out the gate with the first version of a service, and expecting iteration, expecting versioning is going to help you move away from that waterfall environment. Now, that might be uncomfortable to your organization. There's going to be, especially on the application side, members of the application development team that want control over everything. What you need to do is an analogy I like to use here is the application server analogy. Nobody builds transaction infrastructure anymore. Nobody builds logging infrastructure anymore. You're going to use your application server. Nobody builds clustering capabilities anymore. You're using the application server to leverage that. This is no different. You're just simply stepping up that infrastructure a notch to the functional capabilities of the organization. And that can help some people get over the hump because they recognize, hey, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm relying on my .NET environment or my J2EE container to do that for me. And so that can help with making that bridge.
Terrific advice, because I think that many of our attendees are in that situation, whether it's a waterfall or some other traditional SDLC, and they think that while it may work for building services, it may not work for getting the full return or the full bang for their buck, so to speak, of moving to SOA.
That's right. You're just back to new technology, old practices at that point.
Here's a question which I think dovetails into your theme of products as services. The question reads, what testing, validation, and quality tools do you provide SOA developers to assure these aspects?
Yep, that's a great question. You really do need to, again, coming back to that completeness aspect of delivering services, you do need to provide that level of quality. And I'd say there's three types of quality that need to be brought into a service. First of all, it's require very little, maybe just a use case diagram or document. At the design phase, I need my WSDL, I need my design model, maybe I need a test plan starting to be sketched out. At the implementation phase, I need to make sure that my test plan is successfully executed. Of course, I need the executable that I can deploy, all those sorts of things I need in place. And so what you want is the ability to incrementally mandate that sort of information throughout the lifecycle. Repository Manager does a good job of this through its templating infrastructure to incrementally enforce content as you progress through the development governance stages. Then once you have that information, you want to automate as much of the compliance in terms of content as possible. The integration with Policy Manager gives you that. And so Repository Manager can make a call out to Policy Manager, say passing a WSDL, and ensuring that it's WSI compliant. And there are policy packs that can be delivered into Policy Manager out of the box. You can also define your own policies using technologies such as XPath, XQuery, scripting languages, or Java rules to essentially do whatever you want with that. We also enable then integrating external tools. Testing is a good example of that, and you may or may not be aware, we just announced a partnership with ITKO and their LISA testing and service virtualization product. And so there you can plug that product directly into our infrastructure and define a set of, you might think of them as testing policies. And those testing policies can be automatically invoked just as the other compliance policies from a development governance perspective. Finally, then there's some aspects that require human involvement, human review, role-based reviews. So that's where you bring your architect, your business analyst in to review the content functionality, the design model to make sure it's compliant to the organization's expectations, and of course, Repository Manager automates these sorts of capabilities with the automated approval workflow, auditable records, and downstream provisioning and synchronization with the runtime environment.
Terrific, Brent. So lots of tools and lots of integration capability. I see we're running close to the end of our time, but there are a few other questions queued up I'd like to ask you. Maybe we can go through these in a lightning round, kind of
sure.
60 seconds or less with these. This one I think is kind of a tricky topic, too, especially for folks with legacy assets. Our SOA group doesn't have full permission to access the mainframe natively. How do we define and amass those assets?
Well, that's a great question. You need to ensure that your mainframe retains all of its stability and scalability characteristics, but you need to then selectively expose capabilities out of that environment. And I think we've done a nice job with our SOA product in giving you that infrastructure that gives you that isolation level. That's part of the runtime aspects of the SOA product, is to allow you to define services that layer on top without a lot of heavyweight infrastructure. One of the pushbacks that organizations often have is, well, if I try to deploy web services on my mainframe, it's going to be expensive, and then my MIPS counts are going to go way up, and it's going to cost me a lot of money. Well, that's not true with the SOA product. It's a very efficient operational infrastructure, and it gives you that level of isolation while still letting the CICS developers work in the CICS environment and share out those capabilities. So I think that's a real issue, but I think we have some interesting technology that can help mitigate those concerns.
And real quickly, just for those that may not be familiar, what's the full name of that product?
Service-Oriented Legacy Architecture is what SOLA stands for, and it's a very strong product. It was actually built one of the largest mainframe enterprises in the world. SOA Software liked it so much they brought the people over. It's really a great product.
Terrific.
One of the reasons I was so pleased by the acquisition of Logic Library SOA Software is that the Logitech Now Repository Manager product drops right into that end-to-end solution of the SOA software product suite, and we are delivering with the 6.0 version of Repository Manager a fully integrated end-to-end solution that is seamless and reduces a risk from a product standpoint.
Very good point. Brett Carlson, Vice President Technology at SOA Software, thanks very much for taking so much time and especially for taking so many questions.
Thanks for the opportunity.